losing a large number of diversity to the tune of 1 acre per second. That is a tremendous amount of loss estimated for rainforests, 40 to 100 species per year. So, like I said, the natural species extinction rate is estimated from the past data as 1 species per year. We have now moved to the rate of 1 species per hour. So, 10,000 times higher rate of extinction. That is a very, very alarming rate. Next slide, please. And like I said, the causes for this loss of biodiversity are basically human centric. We change the environment to make it more livable. Our population is rising at an unprecedented rate. There is loss of keystone species, and as students of ecology, you will know the importance of what is a keystone species. So that species which disappears and disturbs the entire ecosystem. A very important loss of biodiversity happens when we convert forested lands or natural grasslands for utilization and agriculture. Agriculture, as you know, sustains life for most of the human populations, and a lot of natural ecosystems get converted into agricultural land. That also in itself is a loss of species in terms of biological diversity. Then, of course, construction activities, including large-scale dams and even, I would say, urbanization, is a very, very important component for loss of biodiversity. And international trade, be it for timber, for medicinal plants, and many other products, also sometimes erodes natural population and leads to loss of biodiversity. Next slide, please. Right. Now, while biodiversity is spread all across the earth, depending on the geography and the climate, there are what are known as biodiversity hotspots. So this concept was started by the famous ecologist Norman Mayers, who initially identified 25 hotspots on Earth, which have now been updated to 35 hotspots. And these comprise areas where the largest number of endemic species exist. That means the place where the species have originated or diversified. And interestingly enough, these areas are also the ones with the extreme amount of threat from all the causes that I have just listed. And some people estimate that 70% of the original vegetation has been lost from these areas. More interestingly, hotspots cover only 2.3% of the earth in terms of land area. So although they are very rich in biological diversity, in terms of the actual physical area, they are very limited. And over 50% of plant species and 42% of terrestrial vertebrate species are endemic to these hotspots. So when it comes to conservation of biodiversity, while all biodiversity is important, as managers for conservation, it is recommended to focus on these biodiversity hotspots for in terms of allocating resources and manpower to conserve biodiversity. Next slide, please. So, having realized the importance of biodiversity as well as the need for conservation, there has been a emergence of this whole science of conservation biology, where we use scientific conservation practices that rely on subjects like evolutionary biology, including genetic variation, genetic exchange, species population sizes, as well as the extinction rate, to decide a conservation program holistically to targeted species or targeted areas for in terms of conservation. So it's not done randomly, but it is very scientifically and holistically approached. Next slide, please. So while, like I said, I'll be focusing on plants and more particularly crop plants. So if some of the non botany students For their knowledge, I would like to tell how we differentiate between plants and crops. So plants are the organisms on earth which use chlorophyll to produce food for the entire organisms on earth. But crops are those which have been domesticated by humans to cultivate and through agriculture to produce food, fodder, fiber, and other economically important plants for sustenance on earth. So crop plants are the domesticated plants on earth. So a slight differentiation you should know. And crops are a very important component of biodiversity that has been nurtured by humans and also nurtures in turn the humans. So this is a definition you should remember because I'll be focusing mostly on crop plants. Next slide, please. So like I already told you, there is biodiversity and then there is agricultural biodiversity. So wherever we have domesticated plants, humans, microbes, and any other organisms for the purpose of agriculture is known as agrobiodiversity. And within agrobiodiversity, whenever we are talking of plants, we call them as plant genetic resources. So there are these few terms I'm going to use during my lecture. I thought I would define them first. So crop plants and the wild gene pool that contains genetic material of actual or potential value is what is defined as plant genetic resources. So you have to remember that when I talk of PGR, this is what it contains. The plants that we cultivate and their related wild species and genera. Uh, Plant genetic resources are recognized as a natural resource similar to minerals, oil, soil, and water. And all these natural resources are very important in terms of uh, sociology, politics, commerce, trade. The natural resources are what is going to dictate how countries deal with each other in the future, especially water, I would say now. Uh, the natural genetic variability with reservoir of genes for resistance or tolerance to biotic and abiotic stresses are present in our entire gamut of plant genetic resources. And these PGR provide us agricultural crops, the varieties as such, or they are used as the basic material for breeding new varieties. So students of agriculture will know the importance of crop breeding as also not only new varieties, as also important for diversification of farming systems, whether we do only rice cultivation, wheat cultivation, or a mixed cultivation. So farming systems are equally important. There is another term I will be using quite often in this talk is the word germplasm. Germplasm can be used to define all terms that include plant varieties, land races, wild or weedy relatives of economically important plant species, and these can be in the form of seeds, in the form of tissue culture, in terms of whole plants or DNA. So all this is known as germplasm. So any material by which you can put out a new uh, plant generation is known as germplasm. Of course, DNA has now been included in that. And right now we have not reached the technology where we can use DNA to produce a whole new organisms, but we are using DNA in many, many powerful ways to do a lot of new age crop breeding. Next slide, please. Right. Coming to India. Now, I told you the world has around 35 biodiversity hotspots. And interestingly, 4 of these biodiversity hotspots exist in India. So we have the northeastern Himalayas, we have the Western Ghats, we have the Western Ghats including Sri Lanka, and we have the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and we also have the Indo-Burma region, which is the 4th biodiversity hotspot. Now these areas are having high endemic species. So 4 out of 35 biodiversity hotspot means we are very rich in our biological diversity. So we are one amongst the 12 world mega diversity centers and one amongst the 17 mega diverse countries in the world, which is quite I would say a high amount of richness. Now there is the concept of centers of origin of crop plants, concept given by the Russian geneticist N.I. Vavilov. So you might have heard of the Vavilovian centers of origin and diversity of crop plants. So these are the centers where the cultivated plants, the rye, the legumes, cereals, millets, all the food that we eat have believed to have originated in different parts of the world, known as centers of origin of crop plants. And India is one of the 8 centers which Babylon had proposed. So we have general biodiversity, we also have good agricultural biodiversity. And amongst the flowering plants, 29% of flowering plants are endemic. More than 18,000 species of higher plants are found in India. And very importantly, we have more than 583 plant species which are cultivated in the country. So that's a very high number for a given country. Out of these, 168 are indigenous to India. That means they have originated right here and we have a good diversity of those crop plants. A large number of wild species are found for these crop plants in India. And if we talk of cultivated edible plants, more than 1,000 species, not cultivated, just edible plants found in nature, more than 1,000 wild species are found in our country, and equal number of their wild relatives. So basically to say that India is extremely richly endowed with diversity of crop plants, uh, both cultivated and the wild forms. Next slide, please. So I already told you about my institute. This is the headquarter building in New Delhi. And our main vision is to contribute towards sustainable agriculture by optimizing the use of plant genetic resources for adaptation to climate change, stresses, and changing anthropogenic needs. So as agriculture evolves, our institute contributes in adapting to the changes in agriculture by managing and conserving plant genetic resources. So we have the mandate to manage and promote sustainable use of PGR, to help in coordination, and very importantly, we do capacity building in PGR management. And we also contribute towards policy issues governing access and benefit sharing of plant genetic resources. In terms of capacity building, we are associated with the Postgraduate School of Indian Agricultural Research Institute, which is the same campus as we are in. So IRI, I think, will be known to a lot of students. One of the best schools in the country for agricultural education and research. So we offer a course in MSc and PhD in plant genetic resources. And every year, 5 to 6 students are admitted in these courses. And a lot of people have already graduated and moved on to join the agricultural research services, which is what I am also employed in. And this agricultural research services provides you an opportunity to become a scientist in one of the 105 ICR institutes of the country. You can also take the MSc and PGR course to get a degree in PGR and also become associate professor in one of the state agricultural universities of the country. A large number of our students have also gone abroad and excelled in various fields even other than PGR, having got the basic training from NBPGR. We also provide a large number of courses specifically designed to different aspects of plant genetic resources, including collection and exploration of germplasm, conservation of germplasm, policy issues in germplasm, plant quarantine issues in germplasm, and so on and so forth. Besides management of PGR, we are also involved in molecular profiling of all our agricultural and horticultural crops, and also to detection of genetically modified organisms because our institute is also involved importantly in exchange of germplasm. That means we facilitate in sharing material to different institutes outside the country as also within the country. So that is one of the primary duties that we also do. Next slide, please. Right. So this is just to show an overview of the management activities that is done in our institute. We work towards germplasm acquisition. That means we acquire material from different parts of the country as well as abroad. We conserve it through the various conservation strategies which I will just show you in detail. We are also involved in evaluating and characterizing all the large material that we collect using traditional morphological, cytological, biochemical and molecular tools. We are very actively involved in distribution of material, and we have a whole section of documentation and informatics related to plant genetic resources. And ultimately, all our work is targeted towards utilization of these resources for pre-breeding, breeding, variety release, etc. So we actively contribute towards agricultural development of the country. Next slide, please. Right. Now, today's lecture is focused mostly on plant conservation. And by now, you must have already been told about in situ conservation versus ex situ conservation. So in situ is conserving germplasm in its natural state. It's a dynamic system of conservation, and it allows, very importantly, evolution to occur within the species wherever conservation is being carried out. So classically, the biosphere reserves, the national parks, the gene sanctuaries are the most popular systems of in situ conservation, and I'm sure you must have got detailed lectures on those already. Now, the interesting thing in these is you get to conserve both the flora and the fauna, uh, because plants and animals and microbes tend to coexist. And by doing this in situ conservation, you're allowing the whole ecosystem to be conserved. The, the in situ method related to agriculture is what is known as on-farm conservation. A lot of traditional agriculture happens in our country, depending on where the different ecologies, and a lot of our farmers carry out traditional agriculture. They work with traditional land races and they cultivate it in a particular manner over the years and allow, and just by cultivating it, they are conserving that precious material which contain important set of genes useful for combating stresses, both biotic and abiotic. So wherever this traditional cultivation is going on, it has now been termed as on-farm conservation. So it's natural in the form, it is happening in the same ecosystem without much intervention from outside. So this is also now considered as a form of in situ conservation. Although agriculture technically is nothing in situ, you're taking out a land and then doing cultivation, but now it is termed as in situ on-farm conservation. So these are the methods of in situ conservation, and it has a lot of advantages. But of course, the only disadvantage is that land gets occupied and you have to put on a lot of management resources to sustain these systems. So to overcome this problem, we have a whole set of ex situ conservation. Here, it is termed as static conservation, but it's not exactly static. The only static thing is as compared to the evolutionary process. Otherwise, this also requires constant management practices. So we have what are known as seed gene banks, tissue culture gene banks, cryo gene banks, and even DNA gene banks, besides the field gene banks. So field gene banks can be in the form of crop gene banks or arboretums where trees are conserved, or herbal gardens where medicinal plants are conserved, or even botanical gardens, species of different interest, which have been developed over the year all over the world in different forms. And this is typically called as ex situ conservation. Next slide, please. Now, how do we decide which conservation strategy to adopt. It is dictated by a few things. First of all is the biology of the species. What is the size, what is the population, what is the genetics of the species will decide how we conserve a particular species in which particular form of conservation. More importantly, in the case of plants, what is the nature of the propagule? Whether it is multiplied by seeds or by stems or by, whichever manner of propagation is used, and what is the degree of threat of a particular species. So, for instance, highly endemic species, we will use many different methods to conserve those species because they are on the verge of extinction. Whereas those which are not so much under threat, we will use a more conventional method of conservation. Conservation also gets dictated by what is the kind of infrastructure and kind of technical expertise is available in an organization. So, for instance, NBPGR has the facility of all the three seed gene banks, seed gene bank, in vitro gene bank, and cryo gene bank. So, we can decide on the conservation based on our facility. But wherever facilities are limited, we can always change the conservation mode. Most importantly, the money. So availability of funds and the cost involved in running a conservation facility will also decide how a conservation is done by an organization. Finally, what is the use of the material that one conserves? So we have what is known as an active collection where breeders often take material, or we can have a base collection where it's like fill it, shut it, and forget it. You have just conserved the material for a long period of time. And also whether it's being used in research, in breeding, in exchange. So the mode of conservation will be dictated by all these factors. Next slide, please. So how can we conserve? We can conserve right from whole plants or seeds. Seeds, of course, is the most popular form of conserving plants. We can also conserve them in the form of tissue culture plants or small parts of the tissue, which we call as explants, or we can even conserve pollen, and now we are also conserving DNA. So virtually every part of the plant can be conserved. And again, how we conserve it will be decided on what is our end use. Next slide, please. So, like I told you, there are different forms of conservation. On the top left, you can see the seed gene bank, which is our gene bank in the NBPGR. These are nothing but huge -20 degrees refrigerators where we store the material in the form of seeds. The next to it is the in vitro gene bank, and the cryo gene bank is where I am particularly taking care, and me and my colleagues are working in this particular gene bank where we conserve plants in the form of tissue culture or explants. The in vitro gene bank is run at room temperature, and the cryo gene bank is run at -196 degrees Celsius. I'll come to that a little later. Then on the bottom left, you can see a field gene bank. Again, a very simple form of conservation where plants are grown in a safe field and constantly taken care and maintained in the field itself. Then you can see two forms of community gene banks on the middle section, left and right. So these are gene banks that are maintained by the farmers themselves. The communities and the farmers store the seed in a very simple manner and use it for cultivation and exchange amongst themselves. And finally, on the bottom right, you can see what is known as a permafrost gene bank. That means we place a gene bank in a cold area, permanently cold area. This particular one is in Changla in Ladakh Valley, Ladakh Hills. And here the temperature in most part of the year remains very low, and seed material is kept for a long period of time over here. So NBPGR right now has about more than 4.7 lakh accessions belonging to 2,200 species conserved in the various forms of gene banks. And this is our main business of maintaining these in a live condition for a long period of time. So next slide, please. Right. Now, primarily conservation is easily done as seeds in the seed gene banks, and there are two categories of seeds we recognize. Those which are called as orthodox seeded species and those which are called as non-orthodox seeded species. Now, all our cereals, millets, legumes, few of the oil seeds, and medicinal plants, they all produce what are known as orthodox seeds. That means we can harvest the seeds, dry them, and put them at low temperature around 4 degrees Celsius to minus 20 degrees Celsius. And by drying and putting them in cold conditions, we can increase the storage period for these seeds without losing their viability. Such seeds are easily lend themselves to seed conservation, and most of the 1750 gene banks in the world operate based on this simple principle of conserving orthodox seeds at low temperature and low humidity. So just by drying, you can store them for a long period of time. And seed gene banks are successful by this simple phenomena of the seed to lend itself to desiccation and low temperature tolerance. Of course, there's a methodology how we do it, but that is the basic principle. So orthodox seeds go in the seed gene banks, but there are a large number of species which do not produce orthodox seeds. They produce what are known as non-orthodox. I'll just tell you more about them. There are also clonally propagated species where either the seed is not produced or if the seed is produced, it is not used for perpetuating that species. For instance, a lot of root and tuber crops are propagated vegetatively. Most of the fruit trees are propagated vegetatively if we want to maintain their quality and taste. So such species, and also sometimes in the case of rare, endangered and threatened species, where the plant population itself is very small, the number of seeds produced is also small and not enough for seed gene banks. To conserve seeds in the seed gene bank, there are minimum gene bank standards where about 2000 to 4000 seeds are required for each accession for a safe conservation. So in rare and endangered plants, that is normally not available. So we resort to other methods of conservation. So in such species, we resort to conserving them in vitro gene banks, in field gene banks, or cryogene banks. And next slide, please. And this is where we at NBPGR step in. So I work in what is known as the tissue culture and cryopreservation unit, where we are hosting the in vitro gene bank and the cryogene bank to conserve all the species that I listed to you just now, the non-orthodox seeded species or the clonally propagated species or the rare and endangered species. So our main research is focused on protocol development for conserving these species using tissue culture and cryopreservation methods. We also engage in teaching like all the young people in these techniques, and we also help in exchange of these species. Next slide, please. Right. So primarily we are using two biotechnological tools to do all the conservation. One is the plant tissue culture, which is the nothing but culture and maintenance of plant cells, tissues, and organs in sterile, nutritionally synthetic media and environmentally controlled supportive conditions. Whereas cryopreservation is the process where cells or whole tissues are preserved by cooling to ultra low temperatures, that of minus 150 degrees Celsius to minus 196 degrees Celsius, normally using liquid nitrogen. So these are the categories of plants which I have already told you: root and tuber crops, ornamental crops, fruit trees, plantation crops which have recalcitrant seeds, uh, things like rubber, coconut, coffee, a large number of rare and endangered species, which we are using for conservation using tissue culture and preservation. Sometimes we also use these techniques to conserve medicinal and alcohol producing cell lines. So those of you familiar with the embryogenic cell suspensions and cell lines will know this. Also these days, with the thrust in genetically modified and transformation studies, a lot of these cell lines also need to be conserved, as also transformation competent tissues. So we are using these techniques for conservation of these types of material. Next slide, please. Now, while it sounds very simple that we are using these techniques, there is an entire set of standard operating procedures which need to be followed for conservation of any particular material. So this particular slide shows you the major operations involved in establishing the in vitro gene banks, uh, right from legal acquisition of uh, material, either through import or collecting in the country, then testing the health of the sample. So whenever we need to do conservation, the first step is to make sure that whatever material we are going to conserve is disease free, especially those which are economically important diseases. That means pathogenic diseases to the plant. So we have to get rid of those material. Either we get healthy material or we try to eliminate that disease by various procedures, which I cannot go into detail right now. But once we have the healthy material, we process it for multiplying it in tissue culture, and then we transfer it to the in vitro active gene bank, which is slow growth conservation. I will tell you more details about that. Or we can process it for preservation. Whenever we are using tissue culture techniques for conservation, you must have heard of the term somaclonal variation during tissue culture. Somaclonal variation is variation caused at the genetic level due to the stresses of plant tissue culture. So while developing any protocol, we are very conscious that there is no variation introduced. So we normally do genetic stability testing for all the protocols that we develop. So our cycle gets complete by transferring our in vitro conserved material to field condition as and when required. And then this material can be used to provide to the users, especially researchers and breeders. And all our activities need to be documented in a database system to keep track of all the material. Next slide, please. So I'll just show you in detail how we do exactly tissue culture establishment for conservation purposes. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with tissue culture techniques, but uh, over the last 5 or 6 decades, I will say, tissue culture has come to become an industry now. So a lot of protocols already exist to multiply plants using plant tissue culture. But when we are applying it for conservation, we need to do a little bit of modification. So although standard protocols will be available for most of the crop plants that we work with, still we need to optimize a few conditions like which type of explant to use, what containers to use, what growth medium to modify. And our basic research is in the in vitro conservation method as such. Then we also need to standardize how to keep the cultures in the best conditions. And I will show you in detail. Next slide, please. So culture initiation is the first step for in vitro conservation. Next slide, please. So as Professor Chandrasekhan said, I work on bananas. So a lot of my examples will come from banana. So we start culture establishment. Here we have taken the example of banana. So banana, if you are familiar with the plant, has suckers at the base of the plant. You can see on the top left slide, which can be used for multiplying in tissue culture, or we can also use these male inflorescence buds. So if you have seen the inflorescence, there's a very attractive male bud at the base of the bunch. It contains meristems, and those can also be used for initiating tissue cultures. So once we have decided which explant, so this particular example is with the sucker explant. You can see in the laminar airflow, we take the suckers, disinfected using standard disinfectants, and put it on a defined culture medium and allow the plant to grow. So plant tissue culture, like I said, has become an industry. These are basic steps of tissue culture, which any laboratory can now pick up. Next slide, please. Okay, just move to the next slide. Right. So once we have established these cultures, if you can see on the top right, from one sucker we can get one culture, and then using tissue culture explant excision system, you can produce, multiply it to produce many plants. But before that, each plant that is established in the medium has to be tested for endogenous bacteria, because endogenous bacteria show up in vitro conserved material later on. So this can be easily done by streaking method on standard nutrient media. So microbiologists will be familiar with this terminology. There are standard media for cultivating bacteria in tissue in vitro. And if you streak the explant and it contains any bacteria inside, it will show up on the streak media. Whenever we get these bacteria showing up, we discard the explant and we start with fresh material. Once we have a bacteria-free culture, then we multiply it in large numbers. Next slide, please. And then the bacteria-free cultures are used for testing for endogenous viruses. So although tissue culture gets rid of most pathogens, it's supposed to be aseptic, but literature has also shown us that viruses tend to escape and they remain in the tissue culture. But when we are doing conservation in vitro, we need to get rid of viruses also. So then there is a standard protocol again on how to test viruses. It's a very long, 6-month long process where the plants are again taken out and looked, and viruses are tested for using both the ELISA and serological based ELISA, as well as molecular PCR based techniques to look for viruses. We can also do the visualization of the viruses using TEM, transmission electron microscopy. So once we make sure that viruses are also absent, next slide please, that is when we start multiplying the material for in vitro multiplication. So primarily this is to state that to start a tissue culture for conservation, we need to make sure they are healthy bacteria and virus-free material. Next slide, please. So next we come to micropropagation. Sorry, just before this. So once we have a good material in vitro, we standardize which growth media, what factors like light, photoperiod, and which explant to use for multiplication, to devise methods for in vitro multiplication or micropropagation. So again, standard protocols are available, but when we are working with plant genetic resources, we are working with diverse accessions. So each accession has its own requirement. But when we are devising protocols for in vitro conservation, we try to optimize the protocol in such a way that it works across genotypes in a median manner. So we don't look for optimal mode protocol for each accession, but optimal protocol for a group of accessions. So in some there will be a good growth, in some there will be not so good growth, but growth should be there. So unlike cases where tissue culture protocols are optimized for one accession or one genotype or one variety, here we develop protocols for a large number of genotypes. So that is where our research goes in. Next slide, please. And many factors can affect how the growth happens in culture. Even something as simple as gelling agents. So gelling agents are what helps us in forming semi-solid media. And the most commonly used one is agar-agar. But we can also use phytogel, and in fact in our laboratory we have tested something called as isabgol, that is the husk of Plantago ovata, which has also been used as a medium for gelling a growth medium. And we find that the cultures store in them for a longer period of time. The growth is slower, but they survive for a longer period of time. So just by simply changing the gelling agent, we can change how long the culture stays alive in a particular medium. Next slide, please. Right. And this is a slide just to show that once we have optimized a particular medium, so in this case, we have one medium in which we have added a growth hormone, BAP at 2.25 milligram per liter in case of banana again. And you can see various genotypes of banana respond variously in terms of number of shoot after 2 months of time. So we allow this to happen because management otherwise becomes an issue. But the protocol will be such that all the cultures will survive for at least 8 to 10 months. Next slide, please. So once we have a good multiplication protocol in process, we move to in vitro conservation. Now, tissue culture, as you might be knowing, is a process where which was developed to produce a large number of plants in a short period of time. For us, we do the reverse. We are using the tissue culture technology to prolong the shelf life of cultures for a longer period of time because our objective over here is conservation. So by using conservation, we achieve mid-term storage. Next slide, please. That is from a few months to a few years. So we can have two approaches: germplasm in a growing state, that means in vitro active gene bank, or germplasm under suspended growth, that means in vitro based gene bank or cryo gene bank. So the in vitro active gene bank, we can just allow the cultures to grow that like they do in any commercial tissue culture lab. That means every 2 to 3 months you subculture them and sustain them. Whereas slow growth is certain strategies which we use in our laboratory for increasing the shelf life of cultures. Next slide, please. So these are the normal growing cultures. You just leave them in the normal culture medium under normal culture room conditions of 25 degrees plus or minus 2 degrees. And every few months you have to subculture it. And a few species we allow this kind of growth to occur. The only problem is we need to subculture it frequently, which is costly and labor intensive. Next slide, please. So most of our species, we use short-term conservation strategy. And by changing the physical or chemical environment of the tissue culture, we can increase the shelf life of cultures. The choice of the treatment is largely species dependent and is dictated by the ability to withstand the stresses which occur when we are giving slow growth treatments. Next slide, please. So these are the main methods we use for achieving slow growth in tissue culture. The most commonly used method the world over is reducing the temperature. So normal culture room temperature is 25 degrees Celsius. If we bring it down to 15 or 10 or even 5 degrees Celsius, the cultures stay for a longer period of time. Another method is to reduce the intensity of light or even keep them in dark. Again, that impacts the rate of growth of the culture and therefore cultures stay for a longer period of time. The second most commonly used method is the inclusion of osmotica in the medium. That means normally we are using 3% sucrose to allow the cultures to survive in the form of cultures. But by including things like higher sucrose or even mannitol or sorbitol, it affects the culture, shelf life of the cultures and increases the period in which it survives in the same medium. Although this method of including growth retardants in the medium has been subscribed, but not many laboratories are actually using it because it causes stresses to the cultures. Change of gelling agent I've already told you. Then overall we can reduce the mineral content of the medium and give it minimal growth, and that also helps in increasing the shelf life. We can modify the gaseous environment or we can induce storage organs. Then by changing some certain physical factors like the type of culture vessel, or the enclosure, we can change the shelf life of the cultures. Next slide, please. So this is just to show reducing temperature and light. This is a commonly used method of conservation the world over. Although in NBPGR we are not using that. Next slide, please. Uh, Inclusion of Osmotica. Here's the example in case of Campharia, where inclusion of mannitol increases the subculture period. And this we are using in our laboratory. Next slide, please. Growth retardants like Psychocell, abscisic acid, phosphone D have been reported in literature, but we do not subscribe to it because it can cause damage to the plants, especially genetic variation. Next slide, please. Then change of gelling medium, I've already told you. Minimal media is the one. Next slide, please. Minimal media is one which we use often. That means we reduce the nutrient content of the medium, and then the shelf life of the cultures increases tremendously. We are using this for in case of cardamom in our laboratory. Next slide, please. Then by changing the gaseous environment, so instead of using glass test tubes, we can use these polypropylene poly bags for culture, and these are gas permeable bags, but the cultures stay for a long period of time. And also we can use something like mineral oil overlay. As you can see in the bottom slide, we have successfully used this in the case of a medicinal plant, Bacopa. By adding mineral oil over the cultures stay for 12 months without any subculture. On the left, you can see without mineral oil, the culture dries up in that period of time. So this is a very commonly used method. Next slide, please. Wherever plants have natural propagutes like tubers or bulbs, as in the case of ginger, turmeric, taro, garlic, sweet potato, etc., we manipulate the medium in such a way that these are induced in the tissue culture itself. And once these organs are induced, we don't need to do anything. They will stay for 2 to 3 years in the same media without dying. So this is one of the best methods for not only conservation, but also for exchanging material between laboratories. And this we apply for all our vegetatively propagated plants where natural propagutes are known to exist. Next slide, please. And by changing the physical parameters of the vessel, the culture vessel, the duration for which the culture survives also changes. Even simple things like changing the cotton glass plugs with polypropylene caps, one can change the shelf life of the cultures. Next slide, please. Okay, since we are going very late, I'll just skip a little bit of the tissue culture part and move directly to preservation. So these are just slides to show where we are using different methods to increase the shelf life of culture, and by combining different methods, we can store any tissue culture up to 1, 2, or 3 years without subculturing. That is a very, very long period of time because normally after 3 months, all tissue cultures need to be subcultured. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, we are using mostly minimal media, sometimes reduced temperature and light to store our cultures. In NBPGR, we are doing it at 25 degrees, but other laboratories use low temperature. And of 2 or 3 methods is the best for carrying out in vitro conservation of most of the material. Next slide, please. Then, next slide, please. Okay. While tissue culture is an effective method for medium-term conservation, we constantly need to monitor it for somoclonal variation as well as for loss of regeneration capacity, because sometimes a few species do not sustain themselves in continued tissue culture, and they need to be brought out and reintroduced again. In many systems, it has been shown that after 8 subcultures, soma-clonal variation sets in, or they stop multiplying. So, in looking at all these problems, it was thought that we should have long-term conservation for these group of materials, and for which cryopreservation has been adopted as a technology. Next slide, please. Cryopreservation is a branch coming from the science of cryobiology. It is a relatively new word. It was started becoming popular as recently as 1950s to describe the field of low temperature biology. And it involves the study of effects of low temperature on biological materials or systems. These can be proteins, cells, tissues, organisms, organs, or whole organisms. The temperature may vary from moderately hypothermic condition to cryogenic temperatures. And interestingly, it can be used to both preserve, store, and destroy living cells. So that is the interesting part about cryopreservation. Next slide, please. Now, what happens when we expose plants to very low temperatures? All of us know that biological tissues are extremely hydrated. Almost more than 90% of water in cells is free, and the rest is bound to macromolecules like proteins, etc. Now, this free water that exists in each cell tends to convert to ice as soon as we expose it to low temperature. As soon as temperature approaches 0 degrees and less, free water tends to convert into the ice crystal form. Ice crystals, as you will remember your physics, are hexagonal lattices that easily disrupt cell membranes, causing cell death. Now, most of the cryopreservation strategies rely on how to avoid intracellular cell ice crystal formation. The entire science of cryopreservation is targeted towards avoiding ice crystal injury within a cell. And the only way to prevent ice crystal formation at low temperatures without extreme reduction of water content is through the physical phenomena known as vitrification. Again, you need to recall your school physics. Vitrification is the solidification of a solution without ice crystal formation through an amorphous glassy state. So the entire science of cryopreservation is based on this physical phenomena, how to avoid ice crystal formation in a biological tissue. Next slide, please. So the strategy depends on how to freeze the cells such that little or no water freezes within the cell. It can freeze outside the cell because you will remember that when we do anatomy, cells have intercellular spaces amongst themselves. So if the ice crystal is formed between these spaces, it is less harmful. But if it is formed within the cell, it will kill the cell membrane instantly and the cell will die. So the key for successful cryopreservation lies in the induction of tolerance towards dehydration. Because at the first instance, what we need to do when we are cryopreserving any cell is remove that much of excess water that it does not kill the cell, but when we will cool it, it undergoes vitrification and not ice crystal formation. So two phenomena are always relied upon: desiccation and freezing tolerance. To achieve these, we use what are known as cryoprotective agents, CPAs. And how they work, I will just show you. And how we induce vitrification is by phase transition from liquid to amorphous state in the presence of cryoprotective agents due to the phenomena of supercooling. So a little bit of physics you have to remember when we are talking of cryopreservation. So cryoprotectant agents commonly used for our work are things like glycerol, dimethyl sulfoxide, ethylene glycol, and a combination of these, which can be, these are all substances which can be easily supercooled to -1 to -70 degrees Celsius without the ice crystal stage. Next slide, please. So that's the physical phenomena. Now coming to how we do it in biological tissues. Now, interestingly, we can cryopreserve a large range of tissues. We can cryopreserve seeds, we can cryopreserve zygotic embryos, or the growing part of a seed, that is the embryonic axis. We can also cryopreserve winter buds. So if you have seen trees in a temperate zone, when all the leaves are shed, and as soon as spring arrives, they suddenly sprout buds, leaves. These arise from the dormant buds or the winter buds, and these winter buds themselves lend themselves very easily to cryopreservation. So we can cryopreserve those. We can cryopreserve pollen, embryogenic cell suspensions, somatic embryos, and most commonly the shoot tips or the meristems. So all parts of the plants which have a growing meristem can be cryopreserved, as well as pollen. Although pollen we cannot regenerate whole plants, but it is used for breeding purposes. And also the tissue culture explants can be cryopreserved. Next slide, please. I will not go into the detail of cryopreservation because we are short of time, but this is the basic scheme in which cryopreservation happens. So cryopreservation is a very stressful phenomena for the plant. So it's just like taking a human to an operation theater. Just before the operation, the doctor prepares the patient by, asking them to come to the hospital. So a pre-treatment. You do not allow the patient to eat food, do all the tests, make him or her ready for the operation. So in the same way we do pre-treatment. That means we will expose the plant to either low temperature or high sucrose, slowly remove the water from it. That is all part of pre-treatment and desiccation. Desiccation can be done in many ways, by either introducing high sucrose or just letting the plant sit in a laminar airflow and allow air desiccation. Once it has been suitably desiccated, then we actually freeze it, either through a controlled manner or in a rapid manner, and then we store it in liquid nitrogen. That is the cryopreservation per se. Then once this is completed, the material is stored, but we can always rewarm it to test, give it post-treatment. Again, it's like bringing back a patient from a theater. Very slowly we acclimatize it, and then we test for viability and reculture. Next slide, please. I will just give a very quick demo of one of the techniques. Two of the techniques using banana is an example. So there are a large number of standard techniques now available. I will not go into the detail, but those who are interested can contact me and I'll share some literature regarding that. But I will just show you an example of how we do cryopreservation in banana using various tissues. So, of course, all of you are familiar with the banana plant, which does not produce seeds. That's what we eat every day. But there are seeded bananas also. So we can cryopreserve the banana meristem from the tissue culture, or we can cryopreserve the seeds also, and also embryogenic cell suspension. Next slide, please. So this is our laboratory with the in vitro cultures, and the slide on the top right shows you how a banana tissue culture is multiplied on a high BAP medium to produce what are known as proliferating cauliflower-like meristems. These are meristematic clumps, condensed, and these are what are going to be cryopreserved. Next slide, please. So this particular method is a very simple method for cryopreservation, where plants are multiplied, put on a high sucrose medium, then the meristems are excised under a microscope, then they are put in a cryo vial, frozen in liquid nitrogen, thawed and recultured in liquid medium to get regrowth. So what we are doing over here is, the main step here is pre-culture of the medium on high sucrose for 2 weeks. So within those 2 weeks, excess water is drained out of the tissue, and the meristem does not die. So we don't allow it to die, but all the excess water is drained out, and then we just subject it to freezing. So this method has been successful in certain genotypes of banana, but not all. Next slide, please. So to improve that, we have used what is known as the vitrification technique. So vitrification as a phenomena and vitrification as a technique. Here, after desiccating for 2 weeks in high sucrose, we subjected to a mixture of cryoprotectant known as plant vitrification solution 2, where the tissue is exposed for about 1.5 hours or to 2 hours on low temperature. And then with the PBS2 solution, the explant is put in the liquid nitrogen and thawed and recovered as shown in this figure. Next slide, please. And finally, this is the most common method we use, known as droplet vitrification, where the tissue is placed. If you can see the one on the base with the orange laptop cooler. So the tissue after desiccation and subjecting it to PVS2 treatment is placed on an aluminum foil strip with a drop of PVS2 and then plunged directly in liquid nitrogen and stored in these colored cryo vials that you can see. Next slide, please. So this is how a container with the cryo vials look under liquid nitrogen. These containers can be placed in the cryo tank, as you can see on the lower half of the slide. You can see my student pulling out the container, putting it in these what are known as the cryocanes and placing it in the cryopreservation tank. On the upper right hand side, you can see part of the sample being taken out, thawed in a recovery solution, which is nothing but high sucrose solution, and then culturing it on a particular medium for allowing the regrowth to occur. So this is how we do the cryobanking overall. Next slide, please. And this slide shows how after cryopreservation we can recover the plantlets in the tissue culture, allow them to root, transplant them, harden them and transplant them and put them in the field. So the whole cycle gets completed. So these are all plants rising out of frozen meristems. Next slide, please. And they have come to fruiting and flowering, and we have compared it with the control plants, and we found that cryopreservation does not impact their growth or development in any way. Next slide, please. So different protocols yield different results, and normally our research is targeted towards standardizing the protocol for each species so that we get the highest rate of recovery. So in this case, you can see droplet vitrification of individual meristems is the one that gives us the highest recovery after liquid nitrogen. So once we have standardized the best protocol, we apply it to that particular genus to do the cryobanking in our gene bank. Next slide, please. And again, like in tissue culture, there is the effect of genotype in cryopreservation also. Next slide, please. Like I told you, we are also working with seed cryopreservation. This is an example of how we use embryos for cryopreservation. This is a seed of Ensete, which is a wild, closely related genera to Musa. And very hard seeds have a very interesting embryo. On the top right, you can see these are the embryos which have been excised. And we have recently designed the protocol to conserve these embryos so that whole plants can be recovered simply by using cryopreservation. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. Sorry, the one before that. Yeah, so I mentioned something about dormant buds. So dormant buds can also be used for cryopreservation. The only difference over here is normally we do not use any tissue culture protocol. The dormant buds are naturally cold acclimated and desiccated. We bring them to the lab, desiccate them further, give them controlled freezing, and then after thawing, we directly put them on the live tissue in the field by grafting. So there is no intervention of tissue culture as such in these particular protocols. Directly the bud from the field is frozen, kept in our cryotanks, and then it can be taken out in the field and re-grafted on the stock plants. Next slide, please. And this is a protocol for cryopreservation. In fact, pollen cryopreservation is one of the easiest methods for conservation because the pollen is an already pre-desiccated tissue. It has a thick exine and desiccated tissue. So this can be done routinely, and we are doing it for all our pre-breeding and breeding work, especially in case of where plants have asynchronous flowering. Next slide, please. So uses, I have already told you most of the uses: conservation of germplasm, rare material, cell lines. Very interestingly, we are now able to use cryopreservation for eradication of viruses. That itself is a whole lecture, so I will not go into the detail. But if you look up cryotherapy on the net, you will see a whole area of science on how cryopreservation is being used for elimination of viruses. Next slide, please. And of course, studying the genetic integrity is part of our program. Next slide. And we use all techniques to see if any somaclonal variation is caused either due to the cryostress or due to the tissue culture stress. So we are using both morphological, cytological, biochemical, molecular markers to test for stability, and sometimes a combination of those. And we make sure that no instability is present due to the protocols to which we are subjecting the germplasm. Next slide, please. So this is one example in Eliteria. We do molecular testing and we found no variation. Next slide. And also in Gentiana. Next slide. Okay. So we are using all the protocols I have just mentioned to conserve germplasm. We have more than 12,000 accessions in the cryogene bank and about 2,000 accessions in the in vitro gene bank, some of which has been conserved in the last more than 35 years. So a question often asked to us is, what happens after a long storage period like this? So recently we have taken out plants which were like 30 years conserved, 25 years conserved, and taken it to the field, and we are in the process of monitoring their growth. And the data so far shows us that in spite of the 3 decades of storage, there has been no harm in them. Next slide, please. Similarly, from tissue culture, we have pulled out 20-year-old taro plants, given it to the farmers. In fact, farmers from Kerala requested us to return taro material, which had traditional lion races, and they had lost it because they had been replaced by high-yielding varieties. We gave them 40 traditional accessions, and they are now in the process of cultivating it and growing it on large scale to see which one is suitable for their taste as well as for cultivation purposes. And they were very happy to receive the material which was lost in the field. Next slide, please. So this is basically the overview of how we are using tissue culture and cryopreservation technologies for conservation of plant germplasm. And what we are doing at NBPGR is not only research-based, it is actually the practical application of conservation of germplasm for use. So if you read any literature on conservation, it is not, the slogan these days is not conservation for conservation's sake, but conservation for use. That is the motto of NBPGR, conservation for use. We are sharing all our material freely with any bona fide researchers, breeders, students, and farmers whenever required. We are here to serve the nation, and we, just by showcasing the small work that we are doing, it is also our endeavor to motivate youngsters like you to take up similar activities or maybe join us to be part of our activities and contribute towards nation building in the small way that we do. I take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this national seminar, my director, and all my staff at TCCU. Our work is funded by various funding agencies which I have listed, and these are some of the students and projectors who have been helping us in our work. Thank you all. I'll be very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, questions. Do you have any questions? Okay. Okay, ma'am. Thank you very much for sharing all your expertise with us. Moreover, at the end, you motivated the young researchers to take up the issues. Even I also, this is the first time I am hearing, after 3 decade, you took out the sample from the CRIO and re-established the population. This is the first time I am hearing. Otherwise, theoretically, we know that may be regenerating, but it's quite interesting, ma'am. Thank you very much on behalf of the participants, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.